Star Trek The Next Generation is a very well written show, and there are many episodes that one can point to as examples of great storytelling. But among these, there is one episode that's often cited as the best in the series, and that episode is The Inner Light, in which Jean-Luc Picard lives an entire life in the span of 25 minutes. This episode is Patrick Stewart's favorite, and also my personal favorite, and I find myself revisiting this episode more than any other, and every time I do, I find something new to appreciate. So in this video, I'd like to break down why I think this episode, of all the incredible stories in the TNG series, stands out for so many as its finest. So the very first thing that must be known about The Inner Light is that it was written for broadcast television in the early 90s, and that means it has a very particular format. A 1-hour slot of television generally had 4 or 5 commercial breaks, and this naturally determined the show's dramatic structure. Most episodes of TNG start with a short 2 to 4 minute teaser, followed by the title sequence, then 5 dramatic acts with commercial breaks in between. Total runtime is generally between 45 and 48 minutes, and each act generally ends on a little cliffhanger to keep the viewer watching through the commercials. It was a simpler time, before the dark ages of multiple subscriptions. Now, if you're familiar with this format, you'll remember that the writers often used commercial breaks to signal the passage of time in the story. And in the case of TNG, this was sometimes really creative. A good example is Cause and Effect, in which the Enterprise is caught in a time loop and keeps getting destroyed, only to restart after the break. Great episode. So the commercial break is actually really integral to this format of storytelling, and this is definitely the case for The Inner Light, in which each commercial break is also a 5 to 10 year time skip. Now, I think the best way to analyze any story is to try to understand its moral argument, and for that you generally want to look at how its main character changes from beginning to end. This episode is about the transformation of Jean-Luc Picard, who, as we all know, is the intrepid and somewhat guarded captain of the Enterprise. He's a man of great stature and responsibility, who has very few personal relationships beyond those with his crew. He seldom shows vulnerability, and his life is somewhat lonely. But by the climax of The Inner Light, he's quite the opposite. He's surrounded by family, and he doesn't seem to care about much else. Now, in order to cover that much ground in such a short runtime, the writers not only have to fast forward time, they also have to fast forward Picard's character development, which isn't really something you're supposed to do as a writer. Characters ideally develop gradually. The whole point is to see them grow and change. In this story, we only get a select few moments in which to glimpse the life that Picard is living. And yet the climax of this story is somehow very emotional. It's one of the most affecting dramatic sequences in the entire series. So how did they do it? This episode was pitched to the show's producers by freelance writer Morgan Gendel, originally as a story in which both Picard and Riker lived an alternate life on an alien world devastated by war. The concept went through many iterations before they eventually settled on a story about a civilization sending a probe into space as a way of preserving their culture. Early versions of the script included a more involved subplot on the ship as the crew tries to figure out what's happening to their incapacitated captain. But it was ultimately decided that the episode should focus almost completely on the transformation of Jean-Luc's character and his relationships on the planet Catan. And I think part of the reason that this episode works is that it's very focused and concise. Not a single line of dialogue is wasted. Not a single action or scene is extraneous to the plot. And the action of the plot articulates very clearly the moral of the story. So I think the writers really understood that this episode is primarily a character study. Another reason this story works is that it's deeply relatable. It deals with universal struggles in the human condition. It's essentially the story of Jean-Luc Picard realizing what's important in life. He begins by having to confront the fact that a life he once knew is now gone, and that the person he thought he was is no more. That's something anyone can relate to, not because we've had our brains hijacked by a nucleonic beam, but because life sometimes changes abruptly with no going back. Sometimes the certainty of who we thought we were falls apart in the face of circumstances beyond our control. The first act of the episode is spent with the familiar version of Jean-Luc, the one who never married and who doesn't particularly like children. And he does not accept the story that he is a man named Cayman living on the planet Catan and suffering from a fever that has taken his memory. He goes to great lengths to methodically prove that his new life is some kind of holodeck illusion, but eventually he accepts his circumstances. And this is where we're introduced to the episode's iconic flute. Now, in a story about change, The flute is the only constant, and it's an important story device. Picard is told that he's been learning to play it, though he doesn't appear to have any skill just yet. And the first act ends when Picard notices that his wife's pendant looks like the probe that sent him there. Then we cut to the Enterprise bridge, revealing that virtually no time has passed since Picard was struck by the beam. And go to commercial.
Now that's a work of art.
The 99-cent Daily Double. What you want is what you get at McDonald's today.
When we come back, it's revealed that many years have passed since the previous act. Picard has begun accepting his identity as Cayman, even if he is still a bit preoccupied with finding the Enterprise. In any case, he's committed enough to his new life that he promises to have a baby with his wife Eileen, and this signals to the viewer that Picard has already really moved on from his past, and he's kind of ready to fully live as Cayman. Now, one way that this story stays concise is by implying things about Picard's life rather than showing them directly. And much is implied about Picard's character in this second act. His friendship with Bataille implies that he's integrated into the community. The intimacy and tenderness between Picard and Eileen implies that they have a strong bond despite his apparent memory loss. And the fact that he can play Frère Jacques on the flute now means he's begun to embrace his identity as Cayman, but he's still playing an Earth song, and so he's still attached to his old life to some degree. Now that's a really important detail that we're going to come back to. When we come back from the break for Act 3, we see Cayman and Eileen celebrating the birth of not their first child, but their second child, who they name Bataille, after Cayman's friend who passed away off screen while you were watching an ad for Wendy's. Picard's flute playing has come along nicely, which helps you to feel the passage of time since the previous act. Note that he's no longer playing Frère Jacques. This is a new song. At this point, you realize that the story is skipping huge periods of time, and that Jean-Luc Picard, as we knew him, is really in the distant past by this point. And that's surprising because it means Picard isn't trying to get back to the Enterprise and solve the mystery of why he's on this strange planet. And yet we're reminded that for the crew back aboard the Enterprise, only minutes have passed. In fact, the crew tries to sever the connection, causing Picard to collapse. This is a clever way of synchronizing these two timelines for the viewer so that we understand just how little time has actually passed. We skip ahead again and see that Picard's daughter, Maribor, is now fully grown and she's a scientist. Now, until this point in the story, there have been references to some kind of drought happening, but now it's hinted that the drought is actually an existential threat to the planet. Jean-Luc is trying to convince his daughter to spend less time worrying about soil samples and more time with a young man who is interested in her. And it's here, with the realization that this civilization might not have much time left, that the moral of this story begins to emerge.
Live now. Make now always the most precious time.
At this point in his life as Cayman, Picard's motivations have radically changed. His efforts as a scientist and explorer have yielded no fruit, but for the realization that time is running out. All that matters to him now are his relationships with his friends and family, something he never had in his life on board the Enterprise. Act 3 ends with the revelation that the Catan system was destroyed when the sun went nova 1,000 years ago. This sets up Act 4, in which Jean-Luc discovers that Catan's government is already aware that the planet is doomed and that some kind of plan is underway. Picard's son, now an adult, has followed in his father's footsteps by becoming a musician, presumably because of his own father's flute playing. By the way, this character is played by Patrick Stewart's actual son. Eileen passes in a heart-wrenching scene beautifully portrayed by Margot Rose, and Patrick Stewart does an incredible job of making you feel this loss, even though we've had very little screen time with these two characters. Actually, Patrick Stewart has said that this episode was the biggest acting challenge that TNG ever presented him, which is really saying something, considering the sheer breadth of this series. And it's scenes like this that really make you appreciate his versatility as an actor. And we come back from the final commercial break for the fifth and final act, and Picard is very elderly. He's saddened by the fact that his grandson has no future, and he's completely uninterested in the fact that the community is apparently launching some kind of rocket into space, something that Picard of 40 years ago would surely have been interested in. The launch is the climax of the story, and it's where the story finally reveals its moral lesson. First, we get this beautiful reveal of Bataille.
Die.
He explains the probe, and Picard immediately understands. The mystery of the episode has been solved, but that's not what this scene is primarily about, because there's another reveal. Now, I think the brilliance of this scene is that when Picard realizes that he is actually Jean-Luc Picard and this probe found him in the future, that's not what matters to him in the moment, because that would undermine the moral of this story. What does matter is Eileen. His wife is standing there in front of him, and that's what matters to Picard. And that's the moral of this story. It's a simple lesson that we often hear, but don't fully absorb until later in life, that we tend to take for granted the most important things, often because we dwell too long in the past, or because we're searching for something we can never find. All of the little moments in this story have led to this beautifully dramatized moral conclusion, one with real depth and wisdom.
Eileen.
Now, of course, the episode cannot end there. The scene of Jean-Luc waking up on the bridge is also brilliantly acted by Patrick Stewart, who basically wakes up from a coma and has to process the impossibility that he's only been unconscious for 25 minutes. As always, Stewart takes this kind of far-out science fiction premise and somehow makes it feel completely real and believable. I love this little moment when he looks back at the bridge and smiles, which is the moment that we know that Picard as we know him is going to be all right. But of course, the most famous scene in the episode is its incredible ending, where it's revealed that Cayman's flute was stashed inside the probe. And here Patrick Stewart gives us an incredibly poignant depiction of a man who's just been given a second chance at life, but who has also lost everything that matters to him. Picard plays Cayman's song, now his only connection to his past life, just as he did with Frere Jacques when he was on Catan. This isn't just good writing, it's poetry. As the music plays, we cut to the Enterprise D, soaring gracefully through the emptiness of space. Picard has finally found the starship he spent a lifetime searching for, but in returning to who he was, he is once again alone and once again mourning a past that he can never return to. Wow. It's pretty amazing to me that such a profound bit of storytelling found its way onto primetime television in the 1990s, and it's also a great example of what Star Trek overall is capable of when it approaches storytelling not only as a fun adventure in outer space, but also as a deeper exploration of the human condition. I'd love to hear your interpretation of this episode and other episodes that you think reach similar heights. Check out my Patreon if you'd like to support the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.